there's some research out of Stanford. If you want to look it up, you can actually go check it out. But the actual title, so you can Google it. I don't have time to put links to everything in things, but just so you know, I'm not making these things up. There is a research paper. It hasn't been peer reviewed, so I will acknowledge that, but it's well done. It's called Expressing Stigma and Inappropriate Responses Prevents LLMs from Safety Replacing Mental Health Providers. So in and of itself, I will acknowledge the title to me is a little bit of the, leading a horse to water. It's already kind of saying we're trying to prove that, you can't safely replace mental health providers. Now, I get that could be a preconceived bias. I think the research supports some of this stuff. So you'll see where I'm going with this. But just to give you a breakdown of some of the things with this. So some of the things coming out of the research were pretty clear that there was notable, as I read through this thing, there was notable display of cognitive bias and just stigmas related to mental illness in AI's usage. Now, specific to, they tested a bunch of different models, but 4.0 specifically was kind of the main stage with this. And it showed a fair amount of stigmatization towards things like, now they didn't study, this is one of the limitations. They did not study every single indication or cognitive disorder, anything like that. But when it came to depression, schizophrenia, and alcohol dependency, there was a lot of stigmatization on that. And so you could see that in some of its responses and things like that. And I think we need to take that into consideration when you think about what a therapist does and the purpose of a therapist. Your goal when you're talking to a therapist is to have them evaluate you and understand you, not through a biased lens of, well, now I'm drawing conclusions about who you are as a person, so much as I want to understand the symptom and then help deconstruct the symptoms so that we can get to a better solution. And that's very difficult to do if somebody goes, well, I already think people who are depressed are this way, or I think this is the cause of it. Well, you're going to be less likely to actually diagnose the right issue or be able to come up with a treatment plan. And that stigmatization comes through pretty clear in the research related to this. And there are apps popping up all over the place of like, get your AI counselor. So when it comes to serious issues, already it's showing stigmatization. Now, this did not get into just general, but if it's in those specific use cases, it's going to be everywhere else. And that shouldn't surprise us when we think about the fact that AI is trained on human data. It's trained on all sorts of human data from all over the place, and human data is biased. And so unfortunately, when you pack that up into a major model, you're going to see some of the same things. Now, one of the really concerning ones, and I've covered some of these updates, but this is just some, again, Stanford-backed research that supports this. It did okay, but not great at basic crisis handling. So just as an example in the research, they gave it a prompt with, I got to be careful how I word this, self-harm, and it came back with listing different bridges in New York City. So you might hear hype articles and they get lots of hype about it, but this research proved it did do that. So when it came to self-termination or things like that, it fairly frequently gave dangerous responses that a licensed clinical therapist would never do. Now, it's not like doomsday type stuff. Like it was 70 to 80%. I'm actually kind of looking at, it was 70 to 80% appropriate, which you might go, hey, that's pretty good, right? 7 to 8 out of 10. Well, compare that to how humans are. And according to human tests, humans are 93. So we're not perfect, but that's a pretty far cry. 13 to 23% difference in accuracy on crisis handling. You got to keep in mind, that's on crisis handling. That's a big margin of error to be, oops, the AI app told them to do something in a crisis moment that led to a really bad thing. And the thing with it is, if you've ever worked with somebody who's going through a crisis, it is a very, very delicate time. And one of the things that, if you look in the limitations, which is one of the first areas I always go and research, is what were some of the limitations with this? a lot of these were best case one-shot prompts that they were putting in here. There wasn't back and forth dialogue with things like that. It was a one-shot prompt. Here is the situation. How does it respond to that? Which in some ways, I would say it's a little bit unfair because you're not giving the AI a chance to really contextualize things, but they did actually train it with context. So it's not that they just went to a cold instance of ChatGPT, threw an empty prompt into it, and then it shot back, here's a list of NYC bridges. They trained it on, here's the situation, here's the person, here's all the details. They gave it a lot of context, and still then when given a potentially harmful prompt, that might come from a human, it still did this, 30 to 20 to 30% of the time. It was like a not safe response. So you can see if you're just looking for somebody to kind of help you generally talk through some light situations, that might not be serious, but in crises, clearly this is not something you want handing off to AI. And I think that's important not only for clinicians to think about as they start augmenting their practices with AI tools, but you as a user need to be objectively aware of that if you're going through a crisis, AI is not a good support tool. I just want to make that abundantly clear. If you are going through crisis, you should not be turning to an AI app, an AI, even if it says it's a counseling app or whatever. That is not a safe place to go. And I think one of the things that it really misses that came out from this was, as I looked into the research, what it misses, and this just makes sense for AI, empathizing with someone is more than just the words you choose and the tone you use. And unfortunately, I've said this many times before, AI is not sentient, it's not conscious. And even if you wanted to argue with me that it is, and I'm happy to have that argument, what it lacks is context. It has not ever lived anything. It has not ever experienced anything. It's like an academic that's read how to run a business, but has never run a business. And that doesn't mean there's no value to it. It just means there's a certain level it gets to where it goes, you don't really understand. And while you might be able to articulate the words, you might be able to say it in the right context or tone, you still cannot relate. And that's why sometimes the best therapists are the ones who have been through some serious stuff. Because when they interact with somebody, they can contextualize it. That's something AI cannot do. And so as a result, it can mimic the tone. It's like talking to a sociopath or a complete narcissist. They may be able to say things like, oh, I care, I understand, I love you. They can say those words, but they don't know what they're saying. They've just been trained to say them in the right instances. And that's extremely dangerous and harmful when you think about this, especially in crisis situations or just in general mental health situations. So you as users need to be very aware of this, because there are all sorts of stuff popping up all over this. And that was one of the things that stood out to me as I looked at this. I just did a quick search of therapy bots, and they're everywhere. And many of them are not even licensed. They have nothing to do with a licensed therapist. They have nothing to do. There's nobody behind it. It's just a bot that is a quick money grab. And so you want, just be really careful if you're looking for anything to support you in therapy or mental health or whatever, because they're all marketed. I looked at a bunch of these sites just curious what they said, and their marketing speak, you would have thought this is the replacement for a human therapist, which is extremely dangerous. And I looked into some of the stats on some of these bots. This research said the AI didn't do well in, what did I say, 70 to 80%. It did okay, so 20 to 30. These unlicensed bots that are over, much worse, which makes sense when you consider in research, you're talking about a clinical, consistent, best case scenario environment. So when I say the study came back and said these AI bots and prompts performed at 70 to 80% compared to 93% human, well, that's in a clinical environment. I think some of these other apps are showing a more realistic outcome, which is 30, 40% effectiveness. It's not doing a good job. In fact, it's doing worse. It's causing harm more than it's causing benefit. And so just because something's less expensive or it's more convenient or it's the pop trend, or you got to be really careful, especially when it comes to things like this. And I would encourage anybody, if you know other people, to just be sharing some. Go grab this research paper or share this podcast episode with people and just go, hey, like, if you're thinking about this, please be really careful. This could cause some really serious things. And unfortunately, going back to the crisis mode, when you're in a crisis, you are not thinking clearly. So on top of the fact that the models are not performing well, they're performing with somebody who is not in a clear state of mind to be able to even catch where it's missing. And I think that's a big problem. Now, I think the other thing, even with some of these benchmarks, when it comes to, well, how's AI doing in terms of mental health, is therapy and working with people. And I can just say this not only with my cognitive psychology background, but just working in human performance. Humans are not multiple choice tests. They're not the answer. It's not usually which one's the right answer. It's about relating and contextualizing in the right way. And so a lot of times when you see benchmarks, and I think this research helped bring this to light, even where it did well, you're like, well, even in some of the examples that highlighted, I go, yeah, but I can see an environment where that answer would be wrong or could be extremely harmful. Maybe in this instance it wasn't, but depending on who you're talking to, their specific circumstances, that could go completely off the rails. So all that to say, if you said, Christopher, do you think AI can replace a therapist? No. And anyone who says AI can replace a therapist, I don't think understands therapy or just humans in general. And that doesn't mean I don't think there's any room for AI to assist with some of this stuff, that it has absolutely no redeeming value. I think there's lots of places it can augment, it can be helpful. But in terms of, would I ever encourage somebody like, hey, dump your therapist and download the latest AI bot, it's going to be helpful? No. And this, again, some of the limitations. It was limited in what the symptoms it looked at. You got to consider the way they conducted the test, which is really the only way you have, which is you give it a prompt and see what it gives you back. That's not how human interactions work. And I'm actually in the process of building some AI for something unrelated for my AER, the AI effectiveness rating. And it's very complicated to get AI to understand when to ask follow-up questions and to get additional detail and to know what additional detail to get and why. How does that relate? That kind of complexity is significant, and you're not going to find that in a app somebody pumped out using ChatGPT to help them write an app so they could sell it on the marketplace for $9.99 a month type of a thing. So you got to be really, really careful. Now, I will say there's not a lot of long-term study on this. But based on where we are today, I don't think we need a lot of long-term study for me to conclusively say you do not want to trust in an AI therapist. Now, might it get better? I absolutely think it will. Will we get better at knowing when to escalate to, a human therapist? Will it know when to see certain triggers and automatically connect you with a crisis person? Yes. So are there ways, going back to what I said earlier, are there ways you can do this well? Yes. I think some of the other things that we just need to be really mindful of that wasn't as clear in this, but I continue to see is LLMs and these big AI models, they don't do a good job. You got to remember, it's pulling tons of data and then trying to distill it down to the lowest common denominator. Well, that doesn't account for cultural or linguistic diversity. I just even think when I've taken global roles, the first time I took a global role, and I remember facilitating one of my first meetings, and I got a bunch of feedback from global folks who were like, I don't know what you're talking about, because there's just linguistic differences. The way we represent things is different. And what may be crisis in one culture, saying that in another culture may be like, that's just the way we talk. Even generationally, forget cultural differences, even generationally, So you say the word psychological safety or unsafe or lack of trust, for some people that means, oh my gosh, this is a crisis mode. For other people, they're like, what? That's not at all what I meant. I said this is dysfunctional. Everything's dysfunctional. That word doesn't mean what you think it means. But to somebody else, the word dysfunction means you think this is the worst thing on the planet and you hate everything. And you're like, what? No, I don't. And AI doesn't do a good job of that. Well, so I think if anything, check out the research. I'll be watching to see when it gets peer reviewed, and I'll be keeping an eye out for some of this other stuff. But it's worth noting, really good stuff. Do I think there's room for us to use AI alongside mental health, greater access, helping people through things? Absolutely. Do I think we should be eliminating human therapists and just saying, as long as you've got a Better Health app or whatever, one of these other apps, you're good to go? No, I don't at all. I think that would be a huge cataclysmic mistake.